Welcome to the Separation Anxiety in Dogs Decoded podcast. I am your host, Ness Jones, and we'll be deep diving into all things separation anxiety. But before we get started, please make sure you like this episode, subscribe to the channel, and turn on your notifications so you never miss another one. And don't forget, if you are interested in joining my easy step-by-step training program to resolve separation anxiety in your dog, you'll find the link in the show notes. Now let's get started. So in this episode, I am going to be talking about why it's so important to have a live camera feed on our dog while we're undergoing training. So we've talked about the threshold. We know, hopefully, what the threshold is for the dog. And to do that, we probably need to use a live camera feed for that too. Now, what we don't want to do is record it and watch it back. You can certainly record it, but what we do is have a live one, because if your dog does start panicking and you are watching it on replay, it's too late. You can't do anything about it. So we understand what the dog's body language, we understand what the threshold is, we have a live camera feed on the dog. And then if we see that the dog is buffering up against that threshold, remember in the last episode, I was talking about how we see some subtle signs of the dog being uncomfortable before the panic line. If we understand what our dog's signs are, and if we understand, especially if they have a pattern, then we can break that pattern. So I did mention Slinky in the last episode. Slinky had a very, very clear pattern. So she would get off the couch, she would go to the door. She'd often be okay there at the door, but then the times that she wasn't, she would start circling. Then she would start weaving. Then she would start pacing, and that would get more and more frantic, and then we'd see crying, howling, and, by then it's too late. So if her guardians didn't have a live camera feed on, they can't identify that. If they're watching it on replay, they can't identify that. So it's too late. So what we can do is break the pattern. So if she's comfortable on the couch for 5 minutes, then let's get back in before she gets off the couch. Or maybe we allow her to go to the door, but we don't let the weaving start. We have to be really, really cautious about this, and really, really, it can be quite nuanced, and it very much depends on your dog's pattern or your dog's behavior. What are your dog's signs? And we will definitely be talking about signs in a later episode. So those subtle signs that are showing that your dog is uncomfortable. But again, we cannot address this if you're just watching a replay. It's too late if they start panicking. So we need that live camera feed. Now, you do not have to rush out and buy a camera. You can. Many people do. There's so many different brands. I'm not going to get into brands because it's a quagmire of confusion for me. I don't know what is going to suit you the best. It just simply depends. But let's talk about non-costly things that we can do. So we can do a Zoom call. I'm actually recording this on Zoom. And if you're watching on YouTube, it's literally a Zoom call. So sorry, my computer's doing funny things now. But so that's one thing. And Zoom is free for the first 40 minutes. So you don't even have to pay for it, so which is pretty cool. You have things like Skype as well. I've never used Skype to do this, but it's very much similar to Zoom. Google Meets, Teams, Microsoft Teams. There's a pretty good few options there that hopefully aren't going to be too cost effective. So you would basically set up your laptop or maybe a tablet where the dog is going to hang out. We think the dog is going to hang out, or which is going to give you the best view of the room. And then you tap into the call also on your mobile, which you'll have with you, and therefore you can see what's going on. It's really good. Obviously, you want the sound on. One little tip, though, if you are doing that, make sure the audio on the phone with you is off. So you can hear what's happening inside in the laptop. You can hear if your dog's crying or what have you, but we don't want them to hear you outside because then, they probably can sense that you're nearby and it's not a true absence. So that's really, really important. Make sure that your audio is off, or your microphone is off, I should say, is probably the best way of describing it. So they cannot hear you outside. That's important. So obviously we need that understanding of the dog's body language. Again, we'll be talking about that in the next episode, or not the next episode, in a future episode coming up very shortly. But then we have an additional problem of where to place the camera. Now, sometimes it's quite easy and sometimes it's quite hard. It really depends on the layout of your home. But I have had clients, and I do love this, for dogs that go and hang out by the door. So that's not necessarily a bad thing. So it depends. It always depends. But so some dogs might go and hang out by the door because that's where they go to wait for you. And that's fine. But if they're showing signs of distress, obviously that's not fine. So, but what I do like for those dogs in particular, I have had clients that have taped old devices onto the door at the dog's height. So if the dog is facing the door, the guardian can actually see their facial expressions. They can see if there's a furrow in the brow, if the eyes are wide, if there's whale eye tension, what the ears are doing, etc., etc., etc. And that is often a really good place to put the camera for those dogs. So the camera's face literally taped to the door, and they can see what the dog's doing. But it's not always possible, but I have had clients do that. I had a greyhound client, and they taped an iPad. I don't know how they did this. They managed to get an iPad on the back of the door at the greyhound height. Yes, so but sometimes, I've had one client, she had the door camera. She had a lot of old devices though, so she was very lucky. Maybe if that's something that you need to do, if it's the shape of your home, you could borrow some old devices from friends. Everyone's usually got something lying around, old ones that they're not using. But she had a camera on the back of the door. She had one in the kitchen, or one in the hallway leading to the door. She had one in the living room, and she had one in the bedroom as well. So she could see where the dog was and what it was doing. It's really a great setup. But sometimes, people have them up high in a corner so they get a really good view of the room. The only issue with that is sometimes you can't really see the dog that well. Black fluffy dogs are particularly hard to read because of the camera doesn't pick up their expressions very well for some reason, but so keep that in mind. So sometimes we just need to be a little bit creative about where we stick the camera, or if we can have more than one device looking at the camera. Now, a quick word on talking cameras. So there's things like Furbo, where it's a camera and you can talk to your dog through it. Not a big fan of that. They also can treat dispense. So I have heard of people talking to their dog, and the dog has a complete freak out. So if you did go down that road, you definitely want to do it while you were there and make sure the dog doesn't freak out, because you can imagine some dogs, if they're particularly skittish and suddenly this disembodied voice comes out and starts talking, could give them quite a fright. So be careful about that. But also, if your dog starts barking and you say, Fido, no, and they keep going, what are you going to do about it? You can't do anything about it. If you are, not close by. So it doesn't really serve a purpose. You could say Fido no and Fido stops, and then tell them they're a good boy and dispense a treat. I just don't know, if they don't stop, if they carry on, what are you going to do about it, short of coming back in? And then maybe that's not ideal, because the dog might think that every time they bark, especially if it's at the neighbours or something, and it's not to do with being fearful that you come back in. I am not really concerned about, if your dog is panicking and you come back in, you need to be there for them. It's not a case of, you can't reinforce the fear by giving them comfort. If they need you, they need you. But if they were just being teenagers and barking for the hell of it, and you come back in, they might draw that comparison. It always depends on the situation and the dog and the relationship and all those sort of things, but just be aware of that and be mindful of it. So again, there's plenty of options for cameras. If you're not in my Facebook group, which is Separation Anxiety in Dogs Decoded, and you want to ask about cameras, you want to find out what cameras might be the best to use, I'm really really suggest getting in the group, join the group, and ask in there, because you'll get a lot of advice on what cameras everybody's using. You have been listening to Ness Jones on the Separation Anxiety in Dogs Decoded podcast. Don't forget to check out the show notes to learn more about my programs and how I can help you with tailored training. Until next time.